In the RBA's monetary statement, they have inflation still at 3.8% in December this year, 3.6 June 2025, 3.4 December 2025, 3.3 June 2026. So then we're not even within the 2 to 3% band they want inflation at in 2026. Could they be thinking they don't cut rates by then, or at least cut them maybe once and that's it?
Well, Governor Bullock's had opportunities to talk about her own forecasts. Our forecasts take the budget into consideration, so they'll be a little bit different. It's just a function of timing, not a function of opinion. So that's one point. The other point is important to remember is even with that inflation figure that we got for the most recent quarter, we are still travelling better in annual inflation than we expected in the mid-year update in December. We're actually ahead of that. And the near-term Reserve Bank forecasts are broadly consistent with what we thought in December as well. So we're making progress in the fight against inflation, but it's not mission accomplished because people are still under the pump, and that's why inflation is a big focus of the budget.
That's all true, but in my EFO, Treasury had inflation dropping to 2.75% in 24-25. Now, the Reserve Bank's not saying that's going to happen. Is that still your forecast for inflation?
I will update our forecasts in the budget as we would.
It's gone up?
As we would. Well, you shouldn't assume that necessarily because there's also the impact of the budget itself. And so I'm not going to go through in any detail on the show today the inflation forecasts. They will be different to what they were in the mid-year update. They'll be different to the Reserve Bank's only because ours takes the budget into consideration and theirs doesn't.
If there is another rate hike after this budget, do you take responsibility for that?
Look, I take responsibility for my part of this fight against inflation. You know, the government's budget is important when it comes to inflation, but it's not the only determinant of future movements in interest rates in either direction. It matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. I take responsibility for the fiscal settings in the budget. What you'll see in this budget is a combination of relief, restraint, and also reform, and I take responsibility for that.
Let's talk about migration. Your forecast for net migration for 24-25 in your last budget was 260,000. From what I've been reading that you've been telling journalists, it's remaining the same. But you're now predicting 395,000 in this year after 518,000 last year. That's 20,000 up on what you forecast in December. How are you going to reduce that to 260,000 next year?
Well, net overseas migration next year will be about half of what it was last year. And that shows that net overseas migration is coming back to more normal levels. One of the reasons for that is the work that we've done, ending the pandemic visa, cracking down on the student migration system. All of this has had an impact. And what you will see in the budget, yes, net overseas migration has been high in recent years as the students largely, but also overseas long-term tourists have come back in stronger numbers than when it was anticipated before. But net overseas migration is coming down, partly because of our efforts and partly because it's normalising after that unusual post-COVID spike.
Are you going to lift visa fees substantially in the budget to help achieve this?
People shouldn't expect to see that in the budget. Obviously, that's something that we consider from time to time. But on Tuesday, there won't be, the kind of detail of those considerations.
You've said you have a wafer-thin surplus this year, or you hope to. You wait until the final budget outcome. Isn't it true without the level of immigration that we've had, you wouldn't have that surplus?
The budget is in much better nick as a consequence of a range of things. In this budget, the main driver of the improvement is actually the labour market. The fact that more people are working, more people are earning more, is the primary driver of any upward revision to revenue in this budget. That's important. Commodity prices are playing a role and have played a role as well. So there's a range of sources. But what really matters when it comes to these revenue revisions in the budget is what you do with it. We will bank almost all of it again this year when these inflationary pressures are most acute. And that's been the secret to getting the budget in much better nick. That's why we delivered the first budget in 15 years last year and why we're shooting for a second this year.
But immigration's helped, hasn't it?
All of the time, immigration has a role to play in our economy and it has implications for our budget, not just in the course of the last couple of years. Australia's migration program has been strong really since the war, and it's been part of the success of our communities and the strength of our economy. But it's not the primary driver of what we're seeing in the budget. The primary driver of that is what we're seeing in the labour market.
You've reduced gross debt and you've talked about that, but it still climbs to over $1 trillion, doesn't it? I mean, you used to talk about $1 trillion debt. We're still going to get there, aren't we?
Well, we have saved so much debt by managing the economy much more responsibly than our predecessors. And the consequence of that is we're going to save about $80 billion in interest on that debt over the course of the next 10 years because of our responsible economic management. So we've got those debt levels down. In the year that we're focused on, I think by about $150 billion lower than what we inherited from our predecessors, and that's important.
But still getting to $1 trillion.
Yeah, the debt trajectory that we inherited when we came to office, $1 trillion in Liberal debt, almost nothing to show for it. It's been a big focus, a big reason for our responsible economic management, a big reason why we're showing spending restraint when it comes to real spending growth in this budget.
I had Jane Hume on earlier. She basically confirmed they're going to go to the election with a different tax cuts package to yours. Mm-hmm. But she said it won't be everything they previously had plus your package, if you understand what I mean. It won't be what you say would cost $40 billion over 4 years. What's your reaction to that?
Well, let's see whether they're going to unwind our fairer cost of living tax cuts for Middle Australia. You had Susan Lee on last week, you had Jane Hume on today. They are all over the shop when it comes to these tax cuts. If they're going to give bigger tax cuts for people who are already in the highest incomes, they need to say on Thursday night how they'll pay for that. They're supposed to have a nuclear policy by now, a supermarket divestment policy by now. We don't know what they think about tax. Susan Lee said she wanted to unwind them, our tax cuts. Let's get some clarity. We have got all of this nasty negativity from the Liberals and Nationals, but no policy alternatives. There's been 2 years now where we have absolutely no idea what their economic policy is, and that's because their nasty negativity is no substitute for economic credibility.
Could you see a situation where you go again on tax cuts? If they come up with another proposal, you go to the election with yet another tax cut proposal?
Oh, that's not something we've been contemplating or considering. We think there are other ways to provide that cost of living help, and we've got $107 billion in tax cuts flowing in the coming years from July already, and that will provide that average tax cut of $36 a week in addition to the other cost of living help that we are providing. We do have fiscal constraints. We're trying to get the budget in much better nick. We're easing cost of living pressures at the same time we're investing in the future. All of those things are important, and so you have to weigh up your priorities. You
pledged more money for the urgent care clinics today. Can you tell me a bit more about the commitment to health in the budget?
Yeah, so there'll be $8.5 billion of new investment in the health system, almost $3 billion more to strengthen Medicare further, which is a huge priority of our government. And $227 million of that will be to open another 29 urgent care clinics. These urgent care clinics have been spectacularly successful, particularly for families looking for healthcare for kids outside of hours. Incredibly successful, the ones that we've already built. We want to build on that because out-of-pocket health costs are a big part of the cost of living challenge, and we want to ease those pressures where we can.
And you promised super on paid parental leave. What's the cost of that to the budget?
That'll cost $1.1 billion in this budget, but once it's fully up and running, it'll be a bit north of $600 million a year. So a really substantial investment in the mums and dads of our country to make sure they're still getting super when they're on the government paid parental leave scheme.
Do you expect to deliver another budget in March ahead of an election?
Well, that's up to Anthony, whether or not when we go to the election. My expectation is we'll go full term and I'll be ready to go to deliver a fourth budget. And the reason why that is less relevant to me than you might anticipate is because what I've tried to do with this budget and what we have tried to do is to make the right budget for the economic cycle rather than the political cycle. My view is if you get the economics right, the politics will take care of themselves. So whether there's another budget in March or May next year or whether there's not, I'll be ready to go in either situation, but also our job is just to continue to make the right decisions for the right reasons, to be conscious of the economic conditions and the pressures that people are under, and the politics will take care of itself.
And what's your bet on a rate cut before the election?
Nice try, Andrew. I mean, I don't know how many times we've spoken about this, but you know that I don't come at those sorts of questions. I'm focused on my job. The Reserve Bank will do its job independently.
I look forward to the day we're not talking about inflation, Treasurer. Thanks so much for your time this morning.
Thanks, Andrew. I appreciate it.